You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 191. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. How do you balance your quest for excellence with your desire to be productive? It is the ultimate perfectionist dilemma. And if this is a question that resonates with you, welcome. I am so glad you have joined me here today, and I am excited for us to dive into today's topic. Today, we're going to talk about productivity tips for perfectionists. And the way that we're going to approach today's episode is, number one, I'm going to share with you some examples of how productivity can be a challenge for perfectionists. And in the second part of the episode, I'm going to share with you some tips that you can use to enhance your productivity without sacrificing your standards. So let's dive in. And as I go through some of the examples of how perfectionism might be slowing you down, I would invite you to think about which of these examples resonates with you, and if they resonate with you, how do they show up in your practice? So example number one is that you take on too much. Now, this comes from such a good place, right? You want to be helpful. You want to be useful. You want to help other people solve their problems. And what you may have realized and what you've probably heard is that common saying, if you want something done, give it to a busy person. So if you find yourself being that busy person, chances are people are coming to you to ask you to help them get their work done because they know that you'll do it and they know that you're going to do it really well. After all, you are the person who's going to deliver that perfect work product. And from your perspective, you might find that when people come to you and they have a problem and you can help them solve that problem, it makes you feel good. So it's natural that you would want to take on projects, that you would want to help people out, that you would want to bring more onto your plate. You might also find that there's an element of control, right? If you are able to do things, right? If you are taking on projects, you know that you get to control at least some element of how those projects are done, if not the entire project. And so that can feel really good if what you're trying to create is a very specific outcome. Finally, there's this almost unconscious reason why you may be taking things on. And I found this when I was practicing, and I still do sometimes, is that sometimes when you have so much on your plate, then it almost absolves you from the need to be perfect, right? If you are working and you've got long hours and everybody can see that you've got a lot on your plate, and let's say you produce something and it's not entirely perfect, it's not blowing it out of the park or knocking it out of the park, whatever that expression is, then you can always fall back on that idea that, well, I was so busy. I had so many other things on my plate that I just couldn't get this done to the standard that I wanted to. And people tend to be more forgiving of mistakes or products that maybe aren't perfect if they know that you've had so many other things on your plate. And so there are a number of reasons, conscious and unconscious, that you may continue to take things on even when you're at capacity, when you know that this is going to kind of tip you over the edge. And it impairs your ability to be productive. Now, a second area where you might find challenges to your productivity is that you may procrastinate. Again, I have done my fair share of procrastinating in the past. I have tended to be a little bit better in recent years at managing procrastination. I've got lots of tips and tricks and tools that I use. And this is something that comes up often with lawyers that I work with, right? They find that procrastination is something that really holds them back. Even though they get a lot done and they're smart and they're capable, they still struggle to initiate tasks. They still struggle to reach back to that file that has been languishing in the background for several weeks or several months. And so procrastination is natural for all of us. And as a perfectionist, you may also find that it holds you back from taking things on and getting them done. So there are a couple of reasons why perfectionism can be so strongly linked to procrastination. And one of them is fear, right? It might be fear that you aren't going to complete the task the way that you want to, and so you push it off. One of the areas where I see this come up quite often is writing. So if you're writing a brief that needs to be filed for court, or you're writing something that you know is going to be scrutinized by somebody else, whether it's your boss, whether it's opposing counsel, another lawyer, then you might find that the standard that you have set in your mind is so unreachable that you basically talk yourself out of even getting started on the project. Another area where fear might cause you to push off initiating a project is with difficult conversations. Now, difficult conversations are especially tricky because if it's difficult and there's another person involved, you don't know in advance how that person is going to react. So if you need to deliver bad news to a client or to a colleague, right? It's an unfavorable authority that you have found that is going to significantly affect your ability to win an argument. It might be that you need more time, right? Maybe you took on too many projects and you weren't able to get to somebody's project on the timeline that you promised them. And now you need to go back to them and tell them, listen, I'm really sorry, but this thing I promised that I would have to you tomorrow, it's going to take another week. You might need to tell a client that they're not going to win. Or maybe you receive notice that you lost an application or you lost a hearing, and you're going to have to tell the person who you represent that they did not win. And so that might be something that you want to push off because you simply don't want to deliver that bad news and see how they're going to react. You don't want to disappoint them. And this can be even more pronounced if you feel like it's your fault, right? If you were a perfect person, if you were a perfect lawyer, you wouldn't need to ask for an extension. You would never have a case where things didn't go your way. And so if you're sending that messaging to yourself, it can be really challenging for you to then have those conversations. Another type of conversation that could be really difficult is asking for something you need, right? If you were perfect, you wouldn't have any needs. You wouldn't need to ask for an extension. Maybe it's something else like support, right? Maybe you need additional support at work to help you out with the workload that you've got. Maybe you want to ask for an increase in your compensation and you feel uncomfortable about that. So there's all these ways in which you may find that you are procrastinating, and it's tied back to that notion of perfectionism, right? Another way you might procrastinate is waiting for the perfect time, right? And we all know that there's never a perfect time to do anything, right? The perfect time is simply starting it as soon as you can. Yet what you might do is you might push off that starting point until you have all the information that you need, right? Or enough time to finish a project. This is really common where you might have a project that you anticipate will take about 2 hours. And so you keep waiting for a block in your calendar to show up where you have 2 hours of uninterrupted time. And the reality of your practice may be such that that doesn't happen. And so you might find yourself pushing that project back over time instead of taking a piecemeal approach and getting it done a little bit at a time. You might also find that you create work to create that perfect environment. So it might be organizing your desk so that everything looks absolutely perfect. Maybe you want to bring your inbox down to 0 when your inbox is currently nowhere near 0. You get what I'm trying to say here, right? And so the idea here is that, again, perfectionism might lead to procrastination, which undermines your ability to be productive. So that was the second example. And the third example is where you manage to finally get to a project, right? You have got the time to turn to it. You're not procrastinating. And yet when you are in the project, you may find that you spend longer than you need to on a project. Now, the classic example of this might be where you get so focused, hyper-focused on the details, right? If you're doing research, for example, you might find yourself going down this deep rabbit hole of authorities on a point that maybe isn't all that essential. You might find that you are fussing over the language in a contract where that fussing isn't entirely warranted. It may not be the most salient point that you need to be focused on. So it could be language, it could be details, but what is happening here is that you're spending so much time on a particular project that you are spending too much time, right? You're spending time on details that in the grand scheme don't really make a really big difference, and yet it's still consuming a good portion of your time. Another way that you might be taking too long on a project is where you're holding on to it, right? And again, this is often driven by the same types of fear that might cause you to procrastinate in the first place, right? If you're fearful of making a mistake or getting something wrong or being judged, right? That a judge will read your materials and think that they're not very good, or another lawyer is going to judge you, or your client is going to judge you. And sometimes you might tell yourself that if you wait just a little bit longer, maybe you'll have another idea and you'll be able to make that project that much better. And so you hold on to work even though it's complete. And as a result, you're not moving the ball forward, right? You're not putting it out there for that next step to happen. So you can see how taking on too much, procrastinating, and spending too much time on projects is undermining your ability to be productive. And so the question then becomes, how do you deal with this? So things you may have tried that don't work, you may have tried to drop your standards, right? Everybody might be telling you, right? If they know that you're a perfectionist, for example, this doesn't need to be perfect. Just do your best, do an okay job. And that just might not sit well with you, right? You might be thinking, well, no, the way I do anything is the way I do everything. And I want everything to be to that A+ level of perfection. And so that idea of doing it to a different standard just might not resonate with you in a way that you can actually follow through on that, right? You've got this innate desire to produce excellent work. And so it's hard to go against that. You might also find that you are beating yourself up over any mistakes that you're making. Maybe you are telling yourself that you're too slow, that other lawyers would have done it way faster than you. You might be beating yourself up because you're not setting boundaries, right? You take on a project and it's one that you start to regret and you start to tell yourself, I should have seen this coming. This isn't the first time so-and-so has asked me to do this and I really should have said no this time. And next time this happens, I am going to say no. So again, you're kind of in this thought loop. You're being critical of yourself. You're kind of imagining what you're going to do in the future, or what you should have done differently. And you might even be beating yourself up for being a perfectionist, right? And none of this helps, right? You can beat yourself up day and night, and none of that is going to make you do anything better or faster, but it will cost you time and it will cost you your relationship with yourself, right? You'll start to perhaps impact on your confidence, your sense of self-confidence. You may not treat yourself very nicely. And one of the pernicious side effects of that is that it can unconsciously seep into others and their psyche. And so what you might find is that if you are blaming yourself, if you are beating yourself up, that at an unconscious level, other people start to do that too. And that can be really unfortunate. Another thing you might be trying is working harder, right? You might think, okay, well, I want to be delivering at a level of perfection and I want to be delivering at the volume that is required. And so the only way to do that is to simply spend more time, right? I just need to spend more time working. I just need to work harder. And what you might find there, though, is that you start to feel really exhausted. And the more you take on, the more you might find you're just not able to produce at the quality level that you want. So paradoxically, you may find that the quality of your work actually goes down. And what you might also find is that you become a bottleneck, right? Other people are waiting for you to produce the work so that they can move on with that next step. And yet you're not able to pass that work on because you have so much backlog and you are just one person. And so trying to do it all and do it all perfectly just isn't working. So what I'm offering in this episode is to solve this problem by approaching it from two different perspectives. And the first perspective is an internal one, right? This is mindset work that you can do, some new ways of thinking that can help you to maintain your standards of excellence while also being more productive. And the second approach that I'm going to recommend are some tactical solutions. So these are tactical things that you can do that will help you with procrastination in your practice. So starting with that internal work, starting with that mindset piece, number one is I would encourage you to make peace with perfectionism, right? If there is a part of you, it could be 80% of you, it could be 20% of you, that is a perfectionist. Let's make peace with that part of you, because that part of you is someone or a part of you that has helped you get to where you are today, right? We can thank that part of ourselves that has been the perfectionist, right? That helped you get through school with excellent grades. The part of you that has noticed details that really mattered, that you saw that nobody else was able to see. That drive for perfection has maybe allowed you to accomplish things and create things that you are incredibly proud of. And so when it comes to perfectionism, we don't want to throw that part of ourselves under the bus and say, you're bad, you shouldn't be here, you're just slowing me down. To the contrary, I think we just want to be grateful and accepting. And I think we want to take that part of ourselves and very kindly and gently say to ourselves, thank you. And I've got this, right? You don't need to be on hyper vigilant, hyper alert all of the time. We don't need to do everything to the standard of A++. And it's okay because I am going to be here to help you figure out where we need to apply that hyper focus, that attention to detail, that extreme care in the work, and where we can maybe loosen things up a little bit. So you are taking the reins. Everything is going to be just fine. So that is reframe or mindset shift number 1, is we are going to make peace with our inner perfectionist. Now, the second mindset shift that I would invite you to make is to watch out for all or nothing thinking or black and white thinking, right? This idea that you are either at one extreme or the other. And as you know, as a lawyer, we operate in shades of gray. But if perfectionism is something that you can relate to, chances are you have a tendency to think that it needs to be all one way or it's wrong. So how can you tell, right? How can you tell where you might be applying black and white thinking? Often it's in the way that you speak. So if you start to watch for this, watch for it in yourself and watch for it in others, you'll notice how often we switch into or we describe things in a very black or white kind of way. So some examples, everyone will judge me, right? If I get fired or if I don't win this case, everybody is going to judge me. And the reality is, if you think about who will actually judge you and you were to list out on a sheet of paper the names of the people that will judge you, there may possibly be a handful of people that you think will judge you. And if you went to that list and actually examined, would they in fact judge me? The answer may be yes, and the answer may be no. So already you're starting to see, right? This everyone will judge me, maybe not even true. I'll never find another job, right? So let's say you were to lose your job, there was a restructuring, whatever, and you lose your job, then is it true that you will never find another job? Chances are it is more likely than not that you will find another job, right? You might find a better job. You might find a job that you like more, that pays more, that allows you to use your skills. There are all sorts of options out there. So when you tell yourself, I will never, and maybe it's get another job, I will never win this case, I will never finish this mountain of work, etc. This is black and white thinking. And so we just want to notice it, and then we want to start to question it. I cannot do it perfectly, so I may as well not do it at all. Now, we are still near the beginning of 2025, if you're listening to this podcast when it goes live. And one of the funny things about New Year's resolutions is that because you're starting with a clean slate on January 1st, there is a risk that all or nothing thinking is going to creep into the equation, because you can say on Jan 1, well, if your goal is to go to bed early, here's your first shot at it. And so you set your alarm, your going to bed alarm at 9 p.m. That with a goal to be in bed by 9:30, whatever that happens to be for you. If it's not going to bed early, maybe there's some other goal that you picked. And if by, let's say, January 5th, you have a broken track record, right? Maybe you've gone to sleep on time twice, but 3 times you stayed up way past the time that you wanted to go to bed. You were watching TV, you got, caught up in a conversation with somebody, you started scrolling on your phone. You might think, well, okay, I've only managed to do 2 days out of 3. This is a write-off. There's no point in even having this goal. It's ridiculous. I obviously can't do it. And so you quit. That is an example of all or nothing thinking. And so what I would invite you to do, if this resonates with you, is to start looking for where that all or nothing thinking is coming up for you. And is it giving you the result that you want, right? Is it causing you to not do things because you're afraid of judgment? Is it causing you to give up on goals because you can't follow through on your plan perfectly? And if so, then what can you be doing differently, right? If you were to let go of that all or nothing thinking, if you were to step into the gray zone, then what might be different for you? Now, if this is something that you can relate to, I would encourage you to go back to an episode I recorded at number 164. I looked it up, and it's all about the Pareto principle, right? It's about the 80-20 rule, where this idea is that 80% of your results stem from 20% of your actions. And so it's a really good way of trying to assess whether or not what you're doing is productive, whether it's effective, whether it's worth your time. Is it part of that 20% that's going to give you the 80% of the results? Or are you kind of lost in this no person's land, right? The 80% of action that's only going to produce 20% of the results. Do you really need to be there? This might also help you get more comfortable in that gray zone, right? It doesn't have to be this all or nothing black and white. You can be somewhere in the middle. Now, the third offering I have here in terms of that internal shift is to notice where you're being driven by fear versus where you're being driven by excellence. So are you running away from something that you're scared of, or are you moving towards something that excites you? Now, in the case of perfectionism and productivity, fear might be driving you, right? There might be that scarcity feeling, right? I have to take on this work because if I don't say yes to everybody, then they're not going to like me. I might not get any more work. I might then have no clients. I might then have no job, and then I'll be living on the streets, right? So that fear might be driving you. The judgment, right? If you're fearful that people are going to judge you, and so you're reading over a document for the 500th time, but you've read it so many times that you can't even see the typos anymore. That might be fear driving you. If it's FOMO, right? Fear of missing out, fear of making mistakes. You might be trying to control other people's opinions of you, right? So if you're doing something because you think that it's going to influence the way that other people think about you, which is impossible to do, right? Like it really isn't possible for you to control how other people are thinking about you. But if you're acting from that place, then chances are you're being driven by fear to produce something that in your mind is meeting the standard of perfection. So that's one way you might be driven. The other way that you might be driven is this idea of being called toward or pursuing a standard of excellence, right? And that is more where I see perfectionism as being a super strength, right? Where you've got this innate sense of wanting to produce something that is beautiful, right? You might be wanting to serve somebody in a way that is so impactful for them, right? That makes such a difference, that is giving them something that they really need, right? If you're being driven by excellence, it might be the quest to find the answer, right? You want to be the person who can solve the problem. It might be the aesthetics of a perfect argument, right? I mean, again, are you able to produce something that just reads so beautifully, that is so clear, and you love doing that? It might be completing, right? There may be this drive to complete a project that you want to see done. So there may be moments, there may be projects, there may be tasks, there may be things where you can tell the reason why you're working so hard isn't driven out of that fear of missing out or fear of disappointing somebody or fear of being judged. Instead, you're actually being driven by this sense of purpose, this sense of fulfillment, something that really excites you. And so the idea here is just to notice that, right? Where is that drive coming from? And to start leaning more into those opportunities for you or those situations where it's that love of producing quality that is driving you, and less of those opportunities or less of those situations where it's the fear that is calling the shots. So in terms of the practical implementation, so the first three ideas here that I've shared is number one, to make peace with your perfectionism, whatever part of you may consider to be that perfectionist. Number two was to notice where you are falling into an all or nothing or black and white thinking trap, and to move yourself more into the shades of gray. And then the third is to notice, right? Are you being driven by fear or excellence, and to lean more into the zone of excellence? So externally, what are some practical ways that you can shift from where you are currently potentially to being more productive without sacrificing excellence? And the first suggestion that I have for you here is to start setting more boundaries. And you've heard this a million times, so I'm not telling you anything new. But here, what I'd invite you to do is to take on less, right? Be more discerning in terms of what you are allowing into your world. And one of the ways you might do that is just to decide that your time is extremely valuable and to then place limits on what you take on. And to limit the things that you take on, you will need to decide what the factors are, right? What are the criteria that must be met in order for something to go from being a request or an option or an opportunity to being something that you actually commit to doing. So a few different filters that you might think about. Number one, which is something you may not have thought of, is your zone of genius. There is this lovely concept. It was coined by Gay Hendricks, who wrote the book, The Big Leap, where he talks about these different zones of competence, right? One is the zone of incompetence, one is the zone of competence, one is the zone of excellence, and one is the zone of genius. So incompetence is exactly what it sounds like, that you're just not all that good at something. The zone of competence is an area where, yeah, you're okay, but you're not all that much better than anybody else at doing something. Excellence is where so many professionals, including lawyers, get stuck, because this is where you do something relatively well, right? You are really good at it and other people notice that you're really good at it. And so they want you to do it, right? So you might think about the things that you're doing at work right now that fall into your zone of excellence. You're really good at it. Other people want you to do it. Maybe it's really well compensated, but maybe you don't love it, because what distinguishes excellence from genius, right? What is your zone of genius? Is that in your zone of genius, you are performing at a level that no one else is really performing at, right? This is where you feel that sense of fulfillment. You really love it. It may come really easily to you. You may not even notice that it's a zone of genius because it comes so easily to you. And so you want to start paying attention to where you feel that sense of connection, where you feel that sense of fulfillment, where you get lost in your work because you like it so much. That is your zone of genius. And so you might just be watching out for zone of excellence versus zone of genius and trying to filter out more projects that perhaps fall into the zone of excellence, or perhaps it's competence or even incompetence, but filtering out some of those tasks and filtering in or allowing in more of those tasks that fall within your zone of genius. Now, another filter that you might apply is, does it need to be you? Right? If you've got people who are approaching you and they want you to plan the holiday party and they want you to be training the new associates and they want you to be joining X number of committees, or they want you to take on some projects that maybe you simply aren't really wanting to do at the present moment, right? Maybe it's a capacity question, maybe it's an interest question, but you might ask yourself, does it need to be you? And if it doesn't need to be you, then do you want to do it? Or do you want to divert that project to somebody else, somebody for whom maybe it makes more sense? Maybe it's a growth opportunity for somebody else. If it's, for example, organizing an event at your organization, maybe delegating that task to somebody who's new to the organization would give them an opportunity to meet more people and to develop a reputation as somebody who can get a project done. So you might just think about, does it need to be you? And if not, do you want to do it? Another question you might ask yourself is, does the task project align with your goals? Now, this is true inside of the office and outside of the office. So in your personal life, in your professional life, when you are thinking about taking something else on, how does it align with the big picture, right? Is this going to get you closer to the life that you want, or is it going to pull you off course? And be careful if you try to talk yourself into it, right? You might say, well, it's really not in my strike zone. It's not going to get me closer to where I want to be, but it's just this one thing. So maybe I'll take it on and do it anyways. It'll be less of a fight. People will be happy with me, but there's a risk to that. And the risk is that, number one, you might take on that project and it turns out to be a beast, right? It's way more than you anticipated. And now you've locked yourself in, you've got this big project and it's pulling you away from things that you're truly interested in. That can happen. Also, to the extent that you are involved in this project, right? Even if it is a small one, you're now diverting your time, your energy, your focus to something that doesn't really align with you. And so there's a cost to that, right? You're now not doing the thing that you really, really want, right? Every yes is also a no. And so if you're saying yes to that, you're saying no to something that could be really important to you. So that's another filter is, does this align with your goals? And then finally, if it's a work-related task, you might ask if it aligns with your level of seniority. So you may be asked to take on a project that just isn't at your skill level, right? It might be way below your skill level, in which case you might be wanting to find somebody else to do that, right? Maybe you offer to be somebody who can oversee a project, but again, you'd want to be careful about that. And if it's a task that's way above your skill level, you may want to take that on. You might see that as a growth opportunity, but you might also think to yourself, you know what? That just isn't in alignment with where I want to go right now. And so you may need to find a way to say no to that type of work. So number one of the practical implementation is, yes, we want you to set boundaries, right? What does that look like? It means limiting the things that you take on. It means valuing your time. It means having some filters that you can turn to decide whether or not this is something that you're going to do or not do. Now, the second practical suggestion to increase your productivity is to recognize and manage your procrastination. So I have never met a person who didn't procrastinate on at least something, right? I consider myself to be pretty good at getting things done. And yet there are big picture projects that I have been putting off. And I know that, right? I can see it happening. And so I just know that procrastination is going to show up at some point for almost, well, everybody that I've ever met. And maybe you are the exception to that. But let's assume that you have procrastinated at least once in your life. Let's find some tools that actually work for you to manage and overcome and potentially avoid the act of pushing things off into the future in a way that impairs your ability to get things done. So I will mention that I've got a podcast episode roadmap that I would invite you to download. It is a roadmap of all of the episodes I've recorded in this podcast series that relate to time management for lawyers. There are, I think, 27 plus episodes that are in that roadmap. And what I've done is I've organized them and put them into categories. And one of the categories is procrastination. So if you go to that roadmap, you can see all the different times that I've spoken about procrastination. These podcasts are inspired by conversations that I have with lawyers about topics that are coming up in their practices. So you might find you really resonate with some of the different topics. You wouldn't be the first person. And so the idea here is to really give yourself some tools and ideas to manage procrastination. Now, for the purposes of today's episode, I wanted to share a couple of strategies that you can implement right away. So a couple of tips. Number one is what I would call the pizza method. This ties in with this all or nothing 80-20 way of thinking, right? The pizza method is really designed to help you look at a task not so much as this big block that you need to wait for the perfect time to start and then sit down and do it all at once and do it perfectly. The idea behind the pizza method is that it's a way to take a task and break it down and get started, even if it's a little bit at a time. So the reason that I call it the pizza method is because it's got two ingredients that you might find on a pizza: a pomodoro, which is a tomato, that's the Italian word for tomato, and the salami method. The Pomodoro method you've likely heard of before. It's very popular in time management and productivity circles. And it is the idea of setting a timer for a specific length of time, right? And then simply getting started on a project for the duration of that time. The reason it's called Pomodoro is that in Italy, I gather they've got timers, right? Those cooking timers in the shape of a tomato. And I think the standard Pomodoro is 18 or 28 minutes. I don't think it matters. Set a timer for however long you want. I wouldn't recommend setting a timer for 2 hours because if you look at a 2-hour block, chances are you're going to start to drift. But if you give yourself a pretty concise amount of time, maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe it's 20 minutes, maybe it ends on an unusual number like 17 minutes, but give yourself a discrete amount of time and then look at the project and ask yourself, what can I get done in the next 17 minutes, right? So that's how you're going to want to apply Pomodoro, is to give yourself a discrete amount of time, right? You might not have that perfect 2-hour window, but you've got 10 minutes. What can you get done? And when you start using those small increments of time, you'll find that your productivity naturally starts to increase. The second method under this pizza method is salami. And this is kind of a different way of approaching the problem, but the underlying theory or thing that is happening is the same. It's that you're piecemealing the project. So salami is basically taking a project and dividing it into steps, right? Or slices, And then when it comes time to start working on the project, you just pick one, right? And you can pick the easiest, you can pick the shortest, you can pick the hardest. Doesn't matter. You just want to have your project broken down into pieces, right? That's going to make it way less overwhelming. And then you want to start with one of them. Now, the second practical strategy that I'm offering in relation to procrastination is to talk nicely to yourself. So if you sit down to write that brief and the running narrative in your head is, oh my God, this is going to take forever. I'm never going to make this good enough. The judge is going to tear this argument to shreds. All of the cases are against me or against my client. I don't even want to get this started. I don't even want to do this. Maybe I shouldn't be a lawyer anymore. I should go apply for that job at the coffee shop across the street. My life would be so much better. I mean, if this is what you're telling yourself when you sit down to do your work, number one, it is not productive, right? Because you're having this conversation that isn't getting you closer to where you want to be, which is the finished product. It's demoralizing, right? You're kind of instilling that fear in yourself. Maybe it's motivating, but again, could we be motivated by something that's a little bit different, right? Motivated by excellence, motivated by the joy of getting this project finished, right? So you want to be careful about what it is you're saying to yourself. And instead of saying things like that, right? Things that might make you feel additional pressure or feel like you're not going to do a very good job anyways, what I'd invite you to do is ask yourself some questions like, what's the easiest step? What's the next first step? What can I do here? Or you might tell yourself, you only need to do a first draft. If you do 5 minutes on this, that is enough. It doesn't need to be perfect. And so what you're doing there is you're just going to speak nicely to yourself. Now, the third practical solution to overcoming the productivity challenges you may face as a result of perfectionism is to define the parameters for the quality of the task. Now, as you will have experienced, some tasks will require a greater degree of perfection or excellence than others. So for example, if you're submitting a brief to the court, you want it to be polished. If you are putting together documents for a transaction that is worth billions of dollars, you're going to want to make sure that you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's. If you are about to submit a CV for a job application, yes, you want the formatting to look good. You want there to be no typos. And so there are cases where you really do need to focus in on every detail. And there are also a number of cases where you don't need to do that, right? If you're having a difficult conversation with somebody, you want to be prepared for that conversation, but you have no way of controlling what that person is going to say in response to what it is that you're bringing to the table. And so you don't necessarily need to make the perfect conversation, right? If you're delegating a task and delegation is something that you are working on, right? You're not super comfortable with it. You've been having some trouble with it. You don't need to be the perfect delegator. You need to be someone who delegates and learns by doing how to do it better. If it's a routine email, right, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. If it's the first draft of a memo, it does not need to be perfect. And so what you want to do here is to pick your battles. And when it comes to the standard that you're going to set, I would encourage you to give yourself some criteria, probably, to evaluate whether or not what you've done is good enough, right? So you get to decide what the standard is for good enough. So if it's a conversation that you're having to delegate, you might say, okay, my standard for delegating is, number one, I want to have a pretty clear idea of what I think I want, right? You might change what it is you want based on feedback you get from the person once they've gone out and started to do the job, right? If you ask them to write a brief and they write the brief and you thought it was one issue, but then there's another issue that has come up, you can always change the parameters of the desired product. But for now, right, you're going to have a clear idea of what it is that you are asking for. You're going to speak respectfully. You're going to give them a deadline. So you might be thinking about what the criteria are for you to delegate effectively, not perfectly. So again, you're going to think about what those standards are. So in summary, what we have discussed today, and I'm just going to summarize what we talked about. We talked about these internal shifts that you can make that can help you be more productive without sacrificing excellence. And we talked about external or practical shifts. So internally, I'll just recap those once again, is to make peace with your inner perfectionist. Number two is to watch out for that all or nothing thinking. And number 3 is to notice where you're being driven by fear, where you're being driven by excellence, and to lean more into the latter. Externally, or practically speaking, what I'm going to invite you to do is, number 1, to create filters, boundaries for the projects that you decide to take on. Number 2 is you are going to find tools that will help you avoid procrastination, right? How can you not spend time putting projects off and simply initiate them more easily? And then the third is to define parameters for the quality of the task, right? Instead of having this nebulous idea of what perfect could be, you're going to give yourself very specific criteria, and then you're going to meet those criteria. Now, what will happen as a result is when you have a more curated workload, you'll find that you have more time to do your best work, and ideally, you're less exhausted, right? In the long run, this might help you avoid burning yourself out. With less procrastination, what you might find is that you have more time, right? And you'll feel a sense of self-trust and more confident about your work because you know that you'll initiate that task when you say you're going to do it instead of pushing it off to some point in the future. And as you define the standards that you set for projects, you'll notice that your work product actually becomes even better because you're so conscious and conscientious about the levers that really matter. So instead of trying to do every aspect of that project perfectly, you're now focusing in on the things that really count, which you may find makes your job easier. And also for the person who is receiving it, they now have a pithier product, right? It's more focused. So that is what I have to share with you today. And if this podcast episode resonated with you, I'm so glad. I would love to hear your feedback. I'd love to hear which of these suggestions or strategies is most impactful for you. If you would like help with productivity, right? If you've got a practice where you're feeling like you want to be more productive, you want to have better control over your time, you want systems in place so that you feel at peace, you feel proactive, by all means, feel free to reach out to me. I would absolutely love to help you with that. So you can do that by sending me a note on LinkedIn. You can send me an email. There's lots of ways to reach me. And I would love to hear from you. So with that, I wish you a beautiful and productive week and look forward to reconnecting with you again soon. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.